Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Izzat-Dishley, and I'd like to welcome you to the WOLAS live stream. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Shahad Hamouri on a crucial topic, Palestine and the politics of international law, which she will discuss within the context of historical and ongoing current developments as part of WOLAS crisis talks. Dr. Hamouri is a lecturer in law at the University of Kent in the UK, with a research focus on the intersection of public international law, international economic law, and legal theory. Her current research critically assesses the discourse of business and human rights, specifically within the context of war. So WOLAS would like to express our gratitude for having Dr. Hamouri join us. Thank you for your time and willingness to join us tonight. Before we start with our questions, I would like to briefly introduce WOLAS, the Worldwide Lawyers Association. Established in 2015 by a dedicated group of lawyers and academics based in Turkey, WOLAS embarked on a mission to champion rights on an international scale. WOLAS hopes to be a beacon for those who advocate for rights, with a primary focus on safeguarding the rights of individuals against authorities, both major and minor. WOLAS adopts an approach that questions assumptions and challenges blind spots in the understanding of human rights, all in pursuit of a more inclusive concept of justice. At a time when state authority-induced violence manifests itself through complex institutional networks, WOLAS recognizes the pressing need to shed light on these events, to ingrain them in memory and to prevent them from being forgotten and left to the mercy of dominant forces. WOLAS is an Istanbul-based organization with members that are actively engaged in monitoring and reporting activities concerning humanitarian crises worldwide. It is dedicated to its mission, which encompasses raising awareness, providing essential training, and fostering organized mobilization against rights violations. And you may read more about WOLAS on its website, wolas.org. Now, I would like to start by delving into the nuances of the international legal framework that underpins the Palestinian people's entitlement to self-determination and their right to engage in resistance and armed struggle. Dr. Hamouri, could you please discuss what are the grounds of this for us?
Sorry, yeah. I'm muting myself. So to begin with, I recently was working on, as a part of the legal teams that were drafting submissions to the International Court of Justice. So it's on the case of the illegality of Israeli occupation of Palestine. So it's really important to keep in mind that as the ongoing hostilities are happening, we have an ongoing case with the International Court of Justice that is looking into the illegality of the overall occupation. The main thing to keep in mind is that under international law, occupation itself is not illegal, and of course that is a very questionable position of international law. A lot of people have argued that a prolonged occupation of Palestine is illegal because of its nature, because it's prolonged, because of the systematic human rights breaches that come along with it. However, most of the bigger arguments that were put forth, and specifically by the state of Palestine, were that the prolongation of the occupation goes inherently against the right of self-determination by peoples. So, but we usually hear people referring to the case of Palestine as an occupation. However, we've lately also been hearing the notion of apartheid. So apartheid is a legal framework that allows us to understand how it's like when a state puts forth a legal system that is premised just in racism. So it's a systematic racism that is embedded into the legal system of the state. And here we can see this very clearly in the case of Israel, where you have Jewish supremacy laws that give 2 tiers of life. And not only that, not only in life, but also in the institutions that happen. And then we can see patterns in the sense of the settlements, people living in enclaves, separation of the Palestinian community, and so forth. A lot of analysis has been undertaken on this. So this also adds to so apartheid is another word that we have next to occupation. And then we have another word to add to it, which is alien domination and subjugation. So alien domination and subjugation is the classic case of colonization, as we already know it. However, the case of Palestine is really peculiar because it was colonized at the moment when the rest of the world was being decolonized. So it's very recent that we have actually the revival of this word, but actually from the early times of the establishment of the State of Israel, representatives of the Jewish Agency, which were at the UN defending the establishment of the state, inherently called it a colonial project. And in the 1960s, 70s, you always see a reference to Palestine right next to other occupied states, like in different parts of Africa and Latin America. And it was seen as a sister case of South Africa. So the idea that this is not just an occupation, not just an apartheid, but a classic case of colonization, akin to how France had its own grasp over Algeria. So that means, and I really respect the wording of it, alien domination and subjugation and exploitation. It means that the Palestinian person, the Palestinian subject, is always subjected to the force of an alien authority that is there above them. So Palestinians don't have the independence to do anything. Freedom of movement, freedom of family life, arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killing, you name it. These violations are being committed by Israel. The deeper you delve, the more you find that it is systematic structural forms of human rights abuse that are taken against the Palestinian people on a day-to-day basis, let alone, of course, the situation of Gaza. And the situation of Gaza is very particular, and it's very important to keep in mind that Israel always argues that Gaza is not occupied because its forces left the ground. Occupation is not just about having boots on the ground, it is about practicing control over that area. If you practice the borders of Gaza, if you have the capacity to bomb Gaza whenever you want, and if you control things that go as far as how many calories each person can have, then Gaza is not just under your occupation. You are a colonial entity that is colonizing Gaza, even if, sadly enough, you couldn't have your own settlers on the ground. And of course, there is a very systematic, clear breach of international law Israel is always committing, which classifies as war crimes, which is a displacement of the Palestinian people in settlements, by creating settlements. So the Palestinians now live in enclaves where in between their Israeli settlement communities coming. These are completely, absolutely prohibited. Everyone agrees on how illegal they are. And Israel just keeps and continues to do that. So it's really important when we're talking about the legal context to understand the overall story of what happened to the Palestinians. And actually yesterday was the memory of the Balfour Declaration, and the Balfour Declaration, I think it was the 106th memory of 105th, and it was when Britain had promised the Zionist organizations land in Palestine, treating Palestine as if it was empty, ignoring the indigenous population of Palestinians, leading to very endless recurrent displacement and aggression against the Palestinian people up until today. So that's what we can call the ongoing Nakba. So when we have that context and establish that context in mind, and I'm sorry I took too much time on that, but it's very important to understand that. Then to put that, we need to also understand that there are imperial powers at hand that are not allowing any political resolution of this. At all moments, Palestinians were expected to let go of their own rights. So on to whether or not a legal right of resistance exists. And the answer to that comes from actually the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that says in its preamble that we have put forth these universal human rights for everyone, lest people fall into acts of resistance again, lest people have to resort to violence to protect their own human rights. So the idea that international law protects the right of resistance is implicit in the gravity of the illegality at hand. So when the international community is not seized on the matter, when we have a grave illegality at hand, then that means that the people at hand have no option to practice their own self-determination, but to partake in acts of resistance. So that is the primary premises of where we stand. But of course, there are other legal premises of that. One of them being actually recurrent General Assembly resolutions in the 1950s and 60s that on and on again assured that the people have the right to struggle by all means available at their disposal against alien domination and subjugation. And it also prohibited, and we'll talk about this later, third states and the state itself from prosecuting people for resistance against alien domination and subjugation. Some of these resolutions distinctly also referred to Palestine, and we also have the General Assembly condemning Israel for its suppression of the Palestinian Intifada, which was a mass act of resistance. We also have the International Court of Justice itself, when it did not condemn in the Western Sahara case the acts of resistance by the tribes against the colonial entities. And we also have the very famous Friendly Declaration on Declaration on Friendly Relations, and that one, which was deemed to be of a customary nature by Judge Robinson and Trinidad during the Chagos case, clearly states that people have the right of resistance when faced with alien domination and subjugation. And from that resolution, we have the position of the well-known international legal scholar George Abisab, who then led efforts at the UN to start a movement, for the recognition of the legitimacy of the people's right of resistance. Out of his efforts, and I highly encourage people to read the work of Abisab on this matter, came out in the preamble of the Additional Protocol 1, a recognition of wars of national liberation. So it said in this case that people fighting against alien domination and subjugation have the protections of international humanitarian law. And then we also add to that there is a reference to liberation movements in the Third Geneva Convention. Adding to that, there is no prohibition in international humanitarian law against acts of resistance, because people under occupation, very logically, do not have the duty of allegiance towards the occupying power. So that falls among many other things, which is, for example, state practice with relation to Ukraine. Everyone directly said that the Ukrainian people have the right to resist against the Russian occupation. So why is it that the Palestinian people wouldn't have a similar right? And we'll elaborate this on a little bit more, but just to start touching upon it, the only reason why this right is not taken seriously in the doctrine of international law is because of the bias against positions of states of the global south. And not only that, the devaluation of the works of scholars who have argued and talked about this, just like, for example, Judge Amoun, who in his dissenting opinion to the not dissenting opinion, actually, it was concurring opinion, and then he was the president of the International Court of Justice in the Namibia case, where he talked about the people's right of struggle against apartheid. Adding to that, the Apartheid Convention says that the people have the right to struggle by all means available at their end. So there is an abundant case of state practice, legal principles that show us that it is actually very logical. And if we deny the people their right of resistance, we are simply denying them their right of equality and their right of dignity. Because what we're asking the Palestinian people to do in this case is to simply accept that subjugation when the international community is not recognizing their plight, not having any accountability for any of the Israeli officials over these past 75 years, and not changing anything in the status quo. So to say that they directly do not have that right as a matter of jus ad bellum, so as a matter of the starting of war, so a matter of who gets to start a war, is simply to deprive the fact that they are human. But having said that, of course, when anyone is partaking in acts of resistance, which include armed resistance, but also include all different forms of other acts, everyone has to apply international humanitarian law and has to respect the equal right of life for everyone involved in the case. That is not something that is up for debate or up for discussion. Everyone needs to respect the international humanitarian law.
And I think our next question really goes into what you've kind of tied up with at the end there. There is a narrative within international law that revolves on the equality of all states and peoples, as prominently exemplified in the preamble of the UN Charter that you've already referenced. Bearing this in mind, I would like to ask whether the international institutions which purport to labour for global peace and justice are effectively serving the interests of those who, in Palestine's terminology, bear the heaviest burden in their individual and collective existences.
So to get you clearly, you're asking me about the positionality of international institutions as we speak.
Exactly.
Okay. So actually, there's been very much in the Palestinian community and the Arab community generally, in the ally community, there's been this call of whether or not we should give up our positions in international law, and the complicity of international legal institutions. So the critique of international legal institutions is multifaceted, and we always talk about it in theory, and we all know it very directly. These institutions are inherently in their premises premised on colonial setting, and came out of that, including the UN and the International Criminal Court. So if I may talk about these two, I'll start with the UN. So I was in Geneva last week, and I was tasked with the task of going to different UN representatives to ask them to ring the red alarm bell on the risk of genocide and the incitement of genocide. So it was one of the most real moments of my life, because I could see in their eyes how the narrative that I was speaking, the numbers that I was giving, and even the legal expert position that I was giving was somewhat de facto marginalized. And even when you meet with the UN representatives, they're smiling and acting as if this is not a crisis, that I'm coming to you to talk of something that is of the utmost horror to people on the ground. So there is the cognitive bias of the individuals that stand in these institutions, because we're talking about institutions that inherently will only take the elite of the global south, or inherently will only recognize European privilege in making that. And I provided that critique in a piece that I'm supposed to be publishing soon, on the desensitization of brutality through the language of international law. And in that piece, I talk about actually how the limitations of the experience of the people who are in international institutions shape the limitations of international legal language. Because whether we like it or not, we are all born in our own different circles, and our perception of the world reflects our own experiences. So we inherently, and excuse me for using the technical term, solipsistic. We're inherently reflecting on the world through the lens of our own lived experience. So if you have lived your life through a desensitized life of privilege, it is really difficult for you to understand. And I'm not saying everyone has to have lived through that, but I'm saying there's an absence of plurality of experience where actually we can understand the level of violence that I was speaking about that day at the UN. And the numbers that I was talking about, and the urgency. Some might say, of course, that because they see so many cases, they've become desensitized for it. However, we can see the difference in the reaction. Judith Butler has a great book called The Frames of War, and there she talks about how association and grievability are very linked. So if you associate with the person, if you feel that this person looks like me or talks like me, or perhaps goes to the same conferences as me, you're more likely to grieve them rather than someone who's disconnected from you. And we see that let's say unconscious bias play out, and it's actually quite sad that it's not even verbalized, and the discussion about this is quite very strong in the academic sense, but in practice we're very still far away. However, after that, what happened is actually at some point they realized that what we were telling them on that day, of course a bit late, 1 week after, so we're talking about 4,000 deaths after, they realized, oh, maybe those people who came and talked to my office had a point, and they started to put out positions. However, you can still see that the positions of, and here we're not talking about just, so I was talking before about the different bodies and representatives of people. Let's go to the General Assembly and the Security Council. So the Security Council is a hopeless case. It's the only body with actual power in the United Nations, but there is a veto rule that is imperial, very easy to critique. You know, you have the biggest states in the world with the biggest powers in the world, and they get to play around. It's like we all deny and talk about decolonization and imperialism all the time, but there we go, that big is simple. Meanwhile, in the General Assembly, and you can see how that happens, there is a lot of duress and very soft politics happening. That is going towards the larger imperial powers that are talking about this and the interests that are shaping these positions. In Palestine, we have this tension, and this tension is currently being abused by imperial powers for their own proxy sake, as has happened before again and again and again. So what they see here is a fear of the change of the dynamics, and this is happening. We have seen the world like easily shift from a one-polar world towards a multipolar world, little by little, in the past 10 years, and specifically on a very high pace in the past 2 years. So you could see the push in that, in a very politicized manner, in order to let go of some perceptions and allow some other perceptions. And here I am talking about actually the politicization of what is the language that we choose to speak about Palestine in. So when I went to the UN, I told him we need to urge you to change the framing. This is a classic case of settler colonization. These people are colonized people. We need to use a word that appreciates that this is an asymmetrical case. This is a case of a domination of one people over the other. And of course, there is one government over the other, because I'm not saying that all Israeli people agree about this. I really appreciate that actually lots of Israelis are currently being prosecuted for their positions in trying to support Palestinian people. So here we're talking more about governments. Anyway, so in this case, what is happening is that these powers are playing into shifting the discourse about Palestine only towards two sets of languages. We can only talk about the Palestinian either as a terrorist or as a humanitarian problem, nothing else. So when I went to him, he was like, "Oh, so do we need humanitarian aid?" I'm like, this is not a natural made humanitarian crisis. We do not need more humanitarian issues to discuss about. These are not just helpless civilians who are in need of bread and butter. These are people who are also actors and a part of a very politically dense place. We need to actually conceptualize them as people under settler colonization. And this choice of framing of either this or this, but never people with an inalienable right of self-determination, never of people who are resilient civilians, who are resilient actors, never to conceptualize that Palestinians may have the right to be the agents of their own story. So the choice of language also being used at the UN is inherently one that deprives the people of their agency. So meanwhile, and I'm sorry I took long, but perhaps this is covering a bit of the points. So the ICC is the International Criminal Court is a monster in of its own. Let's keep in mind that this institution was made up in the aftermath of the Nuremberg trials, which was justice. Not in the aftermath. Sorry, it was made in the 90s. It was the core of international criminal law was inspired from the Nuremberg trials, which was victor's justice in its easiest forms. It was a space where the US completely overlooked the fact that it just bombarded Hiroshima and Nagasaki, went there to speak in its own virtuous stance against another very criminal entity, which is the Nazi regime. So it's as if the US now is completely virtuous, but the Nazi regime is but they were both criminals. Not to talk about whatever, but it's the same. We can't deny that the Nuremberg trials came in that light, and that critique is very valid of the Nuremberg trials. So the ICC came to us and declared that these really nice, fluffy words about international accountability. We don't want the Rome Statute talks to us about crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the whole. And states get to choose whether or not to be on it. Israel and the US are not signatories to the Rome Statute. Palestine, when finally in 2014, when it asked to be recognized in 1948, was recognized in 2014, directly joined the International Court of Justice, and then there was, of course, a territorial dispute pushed forth by Israel. But then the ICC said, no, we have jurisdiction to look into what is happening in Palestine. So, but when we look at generally the context, really, the ICC has never served an anti-imperial position. All of its positions have thus far, I think except for one person, all the people tried in the International Court of Justice were African leaders who were in a very big time and a lot of times acting as proxy actors for other actors. But then when the UK was there was a case that tried to push the UK for its involvement in the Afghanistan war, the International Court of Justice simply said that it's not in the interest of justice to look into it. So it's not in the interest of justice to look into it when an imperial power does it, but it's in the interest of justice to look into it when third world states do it. So it's as if it gave this impunity. We live in a world where George Bush is still living, and where Kissinger was given a peace award, where all of these people who are literally bloodthirsty war criminals. There's like the evidence I could give you as a lawyer of the amount of war crimes committed by these people, authorized by these people. And the only reason they run around with impunity is because, well, they didn't sign on their own convention, but at the same time, the legal system, international legal system, is built in a way to avoid that level of accountability. Meanwhile, and the worst thing about it is that they hold that they are virtuous, and they have this language of civilization, of international law, and so forth against everyone else. And the position of the International Criminal Court on this has been nothing but disgraceful. The community of Arabs, Palestinians, allies, like they have proven all of the critique. But as Foucault tells us, cases of extremity are when forced relations are laid bare. This is what we have now. What is the ICC? And I have colleagues who've worked in the internal team at the International Court of Justice, and I've also been in contact with multiple different actors and organizations who worked with the team that is in charge of the case. One is epistemically biased, and with the same thing that I just described before, in the fact that they are solipsistic and actually unconsciously dehumanizing the Palestinians, because they're also using a language and pushing on frameworks where they always put the Palestinians and the Israelis on the same ground, not looking at, no, this is a case of domination. So of course there's a bias of international humanitarian law itself in its premises, but also there's a choice of these people. And the team has been not only very slow in its motion, the main red alert of the fact that Israel didn't allow them any access to even Palestinian territories to investigate should have been enough for condemnation, but no. And then we have the ICC prosecutor Khan. The language he used is apologist, to say the least. He kept on stressing over and over again that he will look for the accountability of Hamas, which no one said no to, including Hamas, who actually the state of Palestine signed on the ICC. So we told them, please investigate. We don't mind. Yes, if people have done things that are criminal to civilians, that is something that should be looked into in a court of law. We need a court of law. We need proper evidence. Meanwhile, in his discussion, he used the choice of wording that he used completely undermined and undervalued the atrocity that we are seeing. And I talk about this with utter confidence because history will stand alone, as it stood in the Rwanda case, as it stood in the Serbia case, in all of these cases where the world looked at something going on and refused to say something, refused to do something. And this is an even worse case because it's this colonial aggression happening as we speak. And to refuse to say something, you are on the wrong side of history. And not only that, the ICC is currently being looked at with very wide open eyes. And I'm telling you, the Palestinian community are almost losing hope. And you know, the thing is, their legitimacy is at stake because you're proving yourself as a completely, like, with a racist bias where you only get the accountability of some people, but some people will still remain in impunity. And the biggest evidence to that, the biggest evidence to the complicity of international institutions in failing to enact their duty to protect is through Israel's current position, because they've done so much across their history with impunity, and they look at us now and say, but why not now as well?
Exactly. Yeah, I think the question of like legitimacy being laid bare at this moment is very much brought to the fore in a undeniable way. Shahad, you mentioned you were in Geneva last week and you've attended various events to stand for Palestine. Could you please tell us about your personal experience as a Palestinian international law scholar and what kind of initiatives you've been involved in, and what did all these personal observations tell you about international law?
Okay, so to the personal bit. So I was supposed to be in Geneva for the treaty talks on business and human rights. So usually I'm focused on more economies. So I was there to try to push for the inclusion of international humanitarian law in the framework. Of course, the politics there was rot. You saw the US pushing against the framework to speak in behalf of its corporations. Corporations don't want to be regulated, and all of these things. And it's very important that I went there actually with the full knowledge of the deep war economy shaping this, the gas interest of Israel, and how it reassured its investors in the past week of, yeah, don't rest assured, actually will still grant you your exploration contracts. Rest assured, nothing will happen. And Gaza is just like a bad hurdle in the face of their investments. And the same with the arms industry that had a spike in the past week, the US and the Israeli arms industry. And then, of course, with the trial of new weapons that Israel will then use in its Israeli corporations like Elbit and Rafael will then use in the marketing campaigns for their weapons. So that was the original agenda. But then, given the rise of deep direct rise of the hostilities, I am currently acting as a non-resident fellow at Al-Haq Center for Applied International Law. So they're a leading center of international law based in the West Bank in Ramallah in Palestine, and I've been working with them for years. So of course, I was never legally allowed to go to Palestine, so I was never able to actually see this land of which I speak, we've been not only overstressed but distraught to the deepest of our existence. The current networks that are currently talking is insane. The first day I arrived in Geneva, we had an emergency meeting, and we were like, okay, we can go talk to the UN Human Rights Commissioner. So he's the highest officer of human rights. And he has an independent mandate of his own. So the only people thus far that have spoken at that moment who have spoken in favor of Palestine were two UN rapporteurs, including Francesca Albanese, who has been a wonderful ally, who has been actually giving us a little bit of hope in actually being understood. She's very supportive, not supportive actually. The good word for it is actually just and a lawyer and has morals. That's the actual. She's just doing her job in as should be done. Meanwhile, and there was also Michael Fakhri, who was the UN rapporteur on food. He went out and spoke in the General Assembly a few days before. But then we all gathered in a lobby, and we were all dressed in black. And none of us, a lot of us were in tears. The night before was really heavy bombardment, one of the darkest nights. None of us, one of my colleagues, she just had a child, so she was telling me how I can't even imagine like this would happen to my own child. So you could see that actually we were all out of energy, and the UN representative for Palestine was also there, and she was telling us about how she felt completely dehumanized by all of the different actors involved. So anyway, so we went in and we had that meeting with him, and actually going in, the security guards stopped me because I had a bag that said boycott Israeli occupation. And said that that's not neutral enough to enter to the building. And I talked to you about that meeting and how it went. And then during the meeting, he asked me, so he didn't say genocide, even though actually I clearly stated to him that I'm a part of a working group. And this is another part of what I'm working on, the working group that got out the letter. And these are leading scholars on genocide. So you're talking about people who worked on the case of Rwanda, the case of Serbia, previous UN rapporteurs, and we all came out with a statement to say that we have enough evidence to say that the Genocide Convention has been enacted and is enacted, and you have the duty to protect. Third states have the duty to prevent. We all need to work with this. And of course, the usual critique for the Genocide Convention is people start talking about it when it's too late, and then the stringent positivist, the nitty-witty details of the hairs. I've had scholars reply to me and be like, yeah, but what about this detail? What about this detail? I'm like, we have enough evidence to say that thousands of people are getting killed, and you're talking to me about that. And the idea that we're going through the debate on proportionality or not, like it's the math is clear. It's the most densely populated area in the world, 16 years of siege, settler colonial entity, 50% children. What more statistics do you get me to say that the aerial bombardment of that area is not even discernible? And the only way to protect both Palestinian and Israeli civilians is to actually give the Palestinians their peace, because otherwise this will keep on happening. Anyway, so that's what we tried to kind of convey to him, but he called us both interesting and passionate, which I find to be quite patronizing. And then he asked us, but what is your plan for the day after? And I was like, so we're accepting that genocide is happening, and that day, the death toll was still, I think, around 6,000 or 5,000, and I specifically said, 1 week from now, it's going to be 10,000 unless we speak about something. And that week has come now. And we are there. We've already seen that. We're talking about a death toll of over 4,000 children. And I don't think, and he looked at us like, so then that was my answer to what is the day after. And we then also had a meeting with the committee. So that was the UN, what were they called? Sorry, they're the special committee, committee of inquiry on Palestine. So there, the meeting was, because they're very much, their focus is the mandate of Palestine. So the conversation went much more smooth. But towards the end of it, actually, a few hours later, the Commission of Inquiry, they had to submit a report to the General Assembly in New York. We were talking to them in Geneva. So one of the representatives represented a report there. She didn't, I think, I'm not sure if that day was a day she used the word genocide or not, but a few days later she used the word genocide. But she was attacked left, right, and center by state representatives who basically called out to say that the UN is biased against Israel, anti-Semitic, and all of those, which are, to be honest, from a completely Aristotelian logic, Platonian logic type, that's fallacious argumentation, you know, and to simply say without any evidence that the simple application of international law and the simple belief that what these people are saying is true leads you to be that. And it was shameful. The state responses were shameful. So if anything, if I can summarize our experience with this, it has been surreal. Even the Palestine representative to the UN the other day came to me and she's like, they're congratulating me for the General Assembly resolution that called for a humanitarian ceasefire. She's like, do they understand? Like, you're congratulating, like, this is not this is a failure on the international community. And as Bassem Youssef even the other day is saying, the Western world does not even understand the level of crime that they are signing onto. CCR, which is the Center for Constitutional Rights, I think this morning gave warning letters to US parliamentary members to warn them of their complicity on genocide. And it's really important to remember how the mass hysteria, like how collective consciousness works towards dehumanizing people. And then one day when the dust is clear, we will see that actually what we've been doing is the mass murder of people. So we feel, and I like to conclude, we feel in a complete state of ethical loneliness. And that is the position where you're left by humanity and your own account and story is being discredited, and your own narration of the suffering that happens to you. So that feeling has been very true, specifically also with the Biden administration coming in and telling us that those numbers are not correct. And with the audacity of that, we're very, very, and I'm sure the Turkish community is the same, we're very, very serious about family names. And we're very, very serious about family heritage. So when we say that over 60 families have been completely cancelled out, like deleted from the registry, we are not giving John Smiths or whatever fake names about this. These are documented deaths of people. When people are questioning these accounts and telling us, not only are they denying the history and existence of the Palestinian people, which has been happening all of our life, we're reliving the trauma of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they're also denying factual reality as it exists. So to go to the UN and see that in front of your eyes, and for people to still shake your hand, I'm like, do you realize that what you just said is simply denying not my humanity and the existence of my people as a people and their basic right to exist? So yeah, it's a lot of feelings.
Thank you, Shahad. You mentioned earlier about the failures of the ICC. I do have a question around the ICC. Perhaps we can tie it in with what you were mentioning earlier. Is it conceivable that the ICC may not categorize all of Israel's current actions in Palestine as genocide? Do you believe it is appropriate for critics to, as it is conceivable, that the court may not categorize all of Israel's current actions in Palestine as genocide? So do you believe it is appropriate for critics to direct their attention towards the ICC in the face of ongoing genocide, or is there a more effective way to mobilize their attention?
That's a very good question. So to start with, as a lawyer and as a realist, and we've already had a lot of meetings about this, and we had meetings about whether or not we should take a case to the International Court of Justice as well, because you can take a case on the prevention of genocide, and we can get provisional measures from the International Court of Justice. The question was then of whether or not we will be able to hold a case on genocide on both accounts. So I would tell you the following. As a lawyer, and if I told you that law will be applied with complete absolute justice, without epistemic biases, this is what's been happening. And the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians has been a proven case all around history. And the fact that what is currently happening is not a military assault by two military factions, but rather actually mass hysteria. Israel always, whenever there is any act of dissent on the Palestinian side, always responds with the most bloody of answers, and the retaliatory intent and also the genocidal intent has been clearly expressed. When you have state representatives calling people who are under their occupation, so technically speaking, under international law, they have the duty to protect the lives of these people more than anyone else, to call them animals, to say that we want to flatten Gaza, we want to obliterate Gaza. The wordings used, like the amount of, and these are state officials that are saying that. So the intent exists, and so then the analysis itself, I haven't had close work on genocide, but actually it's notorious. It's a notoriously difficult charge. And but it's a notoriously difficult charge because the framework itself is biased. Because the framework itself was done in the same treaty negotiations that I saw last week, where you have state representatives pushing the hair of other state representatives for speaking their mind, or even state representatives who don't even have law degrees were coming in to talk. So, so again, if we were in a court of law that upholds justice, yes, it would pass. But with the ICC now, I don't think that directly. I think that very clearly war crimes, very clearly crimes against humanity, and those they would be able to talk about. And I think, like, I can't imagine any future for this case where this isn't what is being said, because like what? Yeah. So the fact that, where do we take them? What is the point of the genocide claim? Even if we know that the bigger international institutions, so we should critique it, but the critique about it now will not be as much effective as actually pinpointing, as this is a critical moment for Palestine, this is a critical moment for international law, and this should be the moment where we're able to also shed light on these inherent biases in the system and to keep that as a very big point in history. So maybe that is a good point to put it to shame. Yes, we should still keep on sending them evidence. We should still keep on giving them those argumentation, and that argumentation will serve us nonetheless. Whether or not they take it, we will at least be able to say history has told you so, we have told you so, and this is the evidence that we choose, that we have to prove to you your own failure as an institution that claims international justice. But where do we take, but also these same legal memos, these same legal argumentations, and these same evidences can be taken elsewhere. They can be taken either nationally, but they can also be taken as a tool in the international discourse about it. Because what Israel now is doing is to deny us from our narrative. So as much as we can to defy that with our own expertise, to actually try to convey the other experience and position in legal terms within legal spaces and create a sense of normativity around it. Having called the word genocide in the past few weeks has had the capacity to help people verbalize what is going on. And so it's very important to have that language to verbalize it and to be able to call it for what it is. And the fact that Israel has committed genocide was spoken of a lot before. Tel el-Zatar, Sabra Shitela, Deir Yassin. So I think the states can be doing the ICC, but not to rely too much on the ICC, but rather to rely on either national efforts or national symbolic efforts, protest efforts, and as international lawyers to feed what we understand is the true, real position into that to drive the discourse. Who knows? Perhaps if we're able to get the peoples to express their positions against the governments, then perhaps we'll be able to push that narrative.
Yeah, on that note, Shahad, how are you feeling about the protests that have been going on? I know you will have partaken in them before, perhaps, and now seeing them on this scale, for example, in London, and different kinds of actions like sit-ins at train stations, things like this that really kind of try to stunt society into some sort of thought process, disrupting commuters, things like this. How do you feel about that in terms of bringing more awareness or perhaps having some kind of effect? Or is it,
isn't that so I've been saying over and over again that if the blood of the people lost is not to be lost, this has to be a historical moment for the case of Palestine, not for this to be understood as an imperial power discourse between Iran, whoever, leave that all aside. The cause of the Palestinian people is a just cause. So, and if the only way we could be redeemed as a people, the only way this will not cause us trauma, that we already very traumatized peoples, but the only way we'll be able to recover from this is through some recognition, reparation, and reconciliation for what has happened. Obviously, there is no political will about this, but during the case of South Africa also, there wasn't political will about this, and the world was still in the same crazy racist position that we see in now. The same with the case of Iraq. Western states have a really, really great history of racist positions and of positions that are completely dehumanizing towards the others. This is not a new thing. But here we are talking about the positions of governments. The main problem with international law is that it only sees states as actors. It doesn't see the peoples as actors, nor does it have any way to translate the position of the peoples and, of course, the positions of the intellectuals. So the positions of the peoples in this case are really important, because the only way that we can change these legal positions is by making ourselves loud and clear. The main reason why the case of Palestine in this case is something that needs to be spoken of on such a wide level is because the Palestinians are stuck, one, in colonization that is not the same in anywhere else in the world, but these states, the UK, the US and other states play a role, even Jordan, play a role in sustaining this. So the only way to shift this is for people to express popular dissent. And it's also a survival mechanism. Like yesterday, I was listening to a podcast by was it Jewish Currents, and they're representatives of Jews for Peace, and they said that the only way to overcome this grief is through action. And of course we're grieving, they're grieving, but then as I told you now and described to you the situation of the Palestinians, we are breaking down. We can't take this. And even yesterday I felt when I was listening to that podcast that women from Jews for Peace actually recognized the fact that we have been doing this for all of our lives. The first time I protested for Palestine, I was 5 years old, and it was Intifada. So it was like that's been a very long history that my grandmother, we're exhausted and we're tired of saying the same thing over and over again. And not only that, we're currently being prosecuted for it. I was prosecuted for it here. Luckily enough, nothing happened, and but I did have some media that tried to more or less defame my position, get me in the weird, not weird, but like manic narrative that is currently happening, where a pro-Palestinian position is inferred, we call it an inferential inflection. You misplace a pro-Palestinian position with an anti-Semitic position, a hating position, and of course that all underlying that it helps this work. The Arab is inherently a violent body, so of course they're Arabs, and to us to stand like this and to hear that, we're going crazy, because like this is so illogical, and to have to yet again say this again and again. So to us to stand and see people do that, like I really appreciate Jews for Peace now, and I really hope that their positions, there's a lot of now TikTok videos of actually Jews in the US who are starting to actually read history, because it wasn't only that Israel was doing what it does, it's also that the Israeli population and the Jews themselves have been done wrong by the state of Israel. Because it has, the people in Israel have been sold propaganda. They've been sold like a history that is so deeply embedded with inferential inflections, like mixing in inferences, to the point where you talk to young Israeli people and they would conflate Nazis with Arabs. They would do a lot of things. So there is. And that's why their anger towards the Arab is somehow so blatant. They're able to dehumanize the Arabs and the Palestinians so much. And they were sold a narrative of history that completely doesn't recognize the existence of the Palestinian people. So to reinsert the story of the Palestinian people in, first, the consciousness of the Jews around the world, and especially people in Israel, and who Israel is working in their name, in a very, of course, this is the most offensive thing to them, and to the wider population who is supporting these countries. The US is selling arms, the UK is selling arms, and inevitably we can't deny the US needs Israel to stay in this position, because it will help in the destabilization of the area to facilitate its imperial powers. And this has been done across all the time. So the US wants it to stay there, the UK wants us to stay there, the EU wants it to stay there. They're all working for their own benefit and interests, are not honest enough to say that. What they're doing is they're selling an illogical narrative that equates wrong things, and that is selling also the plight of the Jewish people in order to cause harm and do plight and grieving on other people. So they're using the grieving on one people to cause grievance for another type of people, which is dehumanizing for everyone on the stage. So we're in a state of craziness. The only way to fight that craziness is through mass action, for people to go on the streets and to say, Palestine, we see you. This is what we need. We see you. We see your story. We recognize it. And so it's been of the utmost importance. And this is not going to end soon. So, and what Israel is relying on is that people lose breath, people lose hope. And what I'm hoping is that we still keep on mobilizing. We still keep on going to the street, and actually for each and every one of us to realize what is their positioning of privilege and capacity in relation to what is happening, and to realize what level of capacity do I have in order to help that, because it's not going to happen. There's no other way. The only way this is going to happen is for people to kind of wake up to that, and for people to push their own governments. And that's already started to work. You can see the hesitance now in this week's sort of narrative and the media's own narrative. Like, they switched off a little bit of the 9/11 language into a bit more into, oh wow, oh these are humans, you know. We're completely, this is not. And of course Israel is selling like Hamas equals ISIS, which is like so dangerous. So like genocidal language is being normalized. So again, sorry, I'm going back to this. And so it's very important. And these are acts of resistance. These are acts, the people united will never be defeated. And that is the chance that is a chance of the liberation of different peoples across Latin America. And you can see that the understanding that the plight of the Palestinian people is integrally linked to all of the other, it's a prototype, and an extreme prototype of how domination works towards all the other vulnerabilities. So actually, the people who are seeing Palestine are way, way, way much more than the people who are selling ignorant narratives about what's happening. And the only way we can tell these people that they are not in power and that we will stand by our humanity is to go out and talk.
Thank you, Shahad. This is a question now based around something WOLAS is doing. So crimes against humanity fall within the jurisdiction of Turkish courts, even if they occur in a different country. WOLAS is currently preparing to bring a lawsuit against Israel for genocide and crimes against humanity in the Turkish courts. Additionally, it started to initiate similar actions in other countries within the region. If Israel faces lawsuits in and across multiple regions and nations, the conviction of Israeli officials in various countries would entail their inability to enter these jurisdictions. And if they were to do so, they could face imprisonment. Do you believe that such collective local legal efforts of this nature can wield a substantial influence on the global stage?
So this has been also tried out with relation to, for example, Syrian war perpetrators. So now a lot of war perpetrators cannot enter Syria, but of course this is a very different case. So one, on the material level, of course, this will one give us the fact that we have judges who, again, will look at this under the rule of law, which is what the Palestinian people want. We want this to be ruled under the rule of law. And the more judicial voices we have saying that this is a crime against humanity in apartheid, and the siege itself is a crime against humanity of prosecution, the systematic, all of it, war crime, and the ongoing case of genocide. If we have more judicial voices in so many different jurisdictions practicing universal jurisdiction, which is actually currently now in the US, that's what a lot of people are going to try to do. And that is what a lot of people are going to try to do in all the different jurisdictions. If we have more voices rising in to say that, then one, we have more juridical authority to shape the narrative on the media. But two, we have a legal position to shift diplomatic relations, because a lot of states are still very complicit, funding, economic, and all that. And the only way we can shift that is for the legal community to stand up and say that this is not a government that you could act with, because any economic relation that you have with that government is going to be contributing to and facilitating a systematic, ongoing, grave illegality that is against international peace and security. So that those could build the premises of very big case law that we currently need. South Africa, apartheid South Africa did not end Algeria during a day. Algeria did not end during a day. Systematic efforts across the world had to be shown. And not only that, all of these different efforts are actually ways to keep the Palestinian people sane, because otherwise we're just risking losing them to insanity in what they're seeing. And I've also heard very similar efforts being talked about in Jordan and in different territories. So here, one, we limit their capacity And the more you ostracize them, the more we're able to show them that this is not acceptable behavior for the international community. And the more we also show that states of the global south, and not only Western states, are the ones who get to say that way we can also be challenging and pointing fingers at the failure of international institutions to do what they are supposed to do, and to defamiliarize. And then they wouldn't, and also the idea that, well, we're not only cutting ties with you because we dislike you politically, but because our judges have said that the worst crimes in humanity, the worst things that anyone can commit against a fellow human, the most racist of crimes have been committed by your officials. And I even don't like, and this is sorry, I even don't understand how anyone in the whole world can still shake hands with Netanyahu or the representatives who went on TV and said we want to kill them and annihilate them. And so this is one effort, and these multiple efforts can then feed into a larger thing. And not only that, they could signal to the international institutions that you are failing.
Thank you. We're gonna tie things together now, but we wanted to ask you if there was anything you wanted to express before we do end the session.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me,
you,
and I really appreciate that. Appreciate the efforts. And if anything, I would just stress that this is a very important moment. We shouldn't look away at all. They just bombed 3 hospitals. The doors of 3 hospitals, ambulances on their way today. We are talking about constant bloodshed. Amplify the voices of the places like the Palestinian civil organizations, and look towards it. Palestine is not just a cause for the Palestinians themselves, it is a cause of international justice. And it could be a turning point that comes together with the demise of the one polar world, where actually states of the global south, vulnerable communities, and marginalized communities will be able to have a stronger voice. We all need to fight for that. And the only way that will come is through active engagement from us, is through active resistance by us against the status quo as it exists. So don't look away, hear the stories, and understand that all of us are connected, all of our struggles are connected, and none of us are free until we're all free. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahad Hamouri, from WOLAS and from our viewers. The live stream will also be uploaded to the WOLAS YouTube channel, so can be accessed then after we close things down today. Thank you everyone that did tune in with us live, and thank you again, Dr. Shahad Hamouri.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate it. Goodbye.
Bye.